On a quiet early morning in a suburban backyard in the United States, soft sunlight filters through thin branches of a maple tree, casting slow-moving patterns across a wooden bird feeder that hangs still in the cool air. The world feels familiar in the way mornings usually do when nothing seems out of place. Distant traffic is muted, a faint wind moves across dry leaves, and somewhere near the fence line, a Northern Cardinal. Northern Cardinal appears in the same way it always does, almost expected, almost routine, its red feathers catching just enough light to stand out against the pale background of winter grass. It pauses on a branch, tilts its head once, then again, as if reading something invisible in the space ahead, and for a moment everything feels unchanged, steady, predictable, safe. But then something subtle happens, something you would normally ignore. The bird does not move forward immediately. It lingers longer than usual, not alarmed, not gone, just waiting in a way that feels slightly off. As if the timing of the moment has shifted by a fraction no one can measure. The feeder swings gently, but there is no wind strong enough to justify it, and the silence between small natural sounds feels heavier than it should, as if the yard itself is holding its breath. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe before you go deeper into this story, because what you're about to see may change the way you look at even the most ordinary moments in nature. And it's not about fear. It's about noticing what was always there but rarely seen, and as that thought settles in, the cardinal still hasn't moved forward. It simply watches. And that small hesitation becomes the first sign that something in this familiar morning is no longer behaving the way it used to. And yet nothing has technically changed, which is exactly what makes it feel so strange. Because sometimes the most important shifts begin in ways so quiet you almost miss them. But that is only the beginning, and what happens next will make this stillness feel even less accidental. And in that quiet space, something begins to feel familiar in a way that is almost difficult to explain, because it is not one single event that stands out, but rather a subtle recognition that seems to rise from inside you as you watch the yard, the feeder, the slow movement of branches, and the way light settles unevenly across the ground. And if you have ever stood near a window in the early morning holding a warm cup of coffee while your thoughts drifted somewhere between memory and silence, you might already know this feeling. That strange awareness that nature is not exactly separate from you in that moment. It feels closer, almost responsive in a way that logic does not fully support. And you notice how often you have seen a Northern Cardinal pause in similar ways before, not just in this yard but in places like it. Always arriving, always watching first, always choosing a moment that feels slightly intentional even if you never called it that out loud. And maybe you have told yourself it is just instinct, just habit, just coincidence layered over routine, because that is what most people do when something feels meaningful but cannot be easily explained. They soften it into something ordinary so it fits comfortably inside daily life. But even as that thought passes through, there is still that quiet sensation that lingers, the sense that you are not only observing the bird but being briefly observed back in a way that is not threatening but strangely attentive. And it is in this space between explanation and feeling that many people find themselves without realizing it. Standing still longer than they planned, noticing details they normally overlook, like the exact branch the bird returns to, the timing between its movements, the way the feeder sways even when the air feels still. And it is almost funny how quickly your attention adjusts once something small feels slightly different, as if your mind is trying to resolve a question it cannot yet form. And if you are new to this kind of observation, you might want to stay a little longer with this moment. And if you feel drawn to stories like this, you can gently subscribe before continuing, not as something loud or forced, but simply as a way to stay connected to these quiet patterns that often go unnoticed. Because what unfolds here is not about sudden revelations. It is about the slow realization that familiar things can begin to feel unfamiliar in very subtle ways. And once you start noticing it, it becomes difficult to ignore. And that is exactly where this morning begins to shift, not in what is happening, but in how it feels to be the one watching it. The longer you remain still, the easier it becomes to notice that the morning is filled with tiny decisions most people never see, not made by people, but by the birds themselves. The cardinal no longer seems interested in the feeder alone. Instead, it studies the space around it first. The fence post, the low branch, the patch of grass beneath the oak where the sunlight reaches a few minutes later than everywhere else. It is as though the food has quietly become only one part of a much larger conversation. Most of us assume a bird lands because it is hungry. That feels simple enough. But spend enough mornings watching without interrupting the silence, and another possibility slowly begins to appear. Hunger may bring a bird into the yard, but trust decides how close it comes, how long it stays, and whether it returns tomorrow. You begin noticing details that once blended into the background. A seed falls untouched while another is picked up immediately. The cardinal turns one seed over with its beak, then lets it drop without eating it. It pauses again, not frightened, not confused, deliberate. There is something remarkably calm about the way wild birds reject what does not feel right to them. They do not argue with the moment. They simply move differently. That quiet confidence is easy to miss because nothing dramatic happens. The feeder still hangs where it always has. The breeze still moves through the branches. Morning light still warms the edge of the porch. Yet something beneath the surface has shifted. It is almost like standing beside someone you have known for years and suddenly realizing they have been trying to tell you something without ever speaking. And this is where the ordinary backyard begins revealing a hidden layer, because the smallest choices a bird makes often carry meanings that only become visible after they have been repeated enough times for your own intuition to finally catch up. At some point, the quiet observation begins to shift into something more structured, as if what you are seeing has patterns that extend beyond a single morning or a single yard. And without changing anything about the scene itself, your attention starts to catch on details that feel strangely consistent. The Northern Cardinal does not simply arrive at random intervals. It returns within windows that feel almost measured, sometimes within the same few minutes of the previous day, as if its presence is anchored to something invisible in the rhythm of the morning itself. You might notice it appears just after the light reaches a certain angle across the fence, or just before the feeder stops swinging completely still, and while none of this would normally feel important on its own, the repetition begins to create a quiet sense of structure where there should only be chance. Scientists who study bird behavior describe something called spatial and temporal memory, where birds do not just recognize locations, but also remember when those locations tend to be safe or rewarding. In simple terms, a bird is not only learning where to go, but also when it is most likely to go there without risk. Studies from urban ornithology research have shown that many backyard species can adjust their feeding schedules within just a few days of consistent patterns, sometimes arriving within a narrow time window each morning that remains surprisingly stable. This does not make the moment less mysterious, but it gives it a kind of grounding, as if what feels intuitive or meaningful is also supported by quiet layers of adaptation happening beneath awareness. The feeder itself is not just an object of food, but a reference point in a living map that birds continuously update, responding to safety, repetition, and subtle environmental cues most humans never consciously register. And yet, even knowing this, standing there in the stillness of a suburban yard, watching the cardinal hesitate on a branch before moving closer, it is difficult not to feel that there is something more than simple routine at play, something that exists between instinct and recognition, where behavior and movement to overlap in ways that feel almost personal. By now, the morning does not feel like something you are simply watching anymore. It feels like something you are slowly learning to share space with, as if the boundary between observer and observed has become thinner without you noticing the exact moment it changed. The Northern Cardinal returns again, but this time the movement feels closer, not physically, but in the way it chooses its pauses, lingering on the same low branch just a few feet from the feeder, turning its head in small, deliberate angles that feel almost synchronized with the stillness of the yard itself. You start to notice how often your own attention waits for it now, how your eyes drift toward the same branch before the bird even arrives, as if a quiet expectation has already formed without permission. There is something subtle about this kind of repetition that changes the way a moment feels, because when something happens once it is coincidence, but when it begins to happen again, your mind starts to build a quiet familiarity around it, a sense that the pattern is no longer random even if nothing has been confirmed. The feeder creaks slightly as it sways, and the sound feels louder than it should, not because it has changed, but because your awareness of silence around it has deepened. The bird does not rush. It does not hesitate in fear. It simply exists in the space with a kind of presence that makes the yard feel less like background and more like a shared environment. And somewhere in this slow unfolding, you might realize that you are no longer just noticing the bird when it appears, you are beginning to notice the absence of it when it is gone. And that shift is what quietly changes everything, Because once a presence becomes something you expect, even its silence begins to feel like part of the conversation. At a certain point in the morning, the repetition no longer feels like repetition at all. It begins to feel like a system you have quietly entered without realizing, where every small movement in the yard carries a weight that is slightly more defined than before. The Northern Cardinal arrives again, but this time its behavior feels more layered, as if each pause is not just hesitation but selection, choosing between branches, choosing between distances, choosing the exact angle from which it observes the space around the feeder. The air feels still, yet not empty, as if something in it is being measured in ways you cannot directly see. You start noticing that other birds in the distance respond differently when it is present, a subtle quieting, a brief recalibration of movement in nearby trees, and although it is easy to dismiss such things as coincidence, the consistency begins to accumulate in a way that is difficult to ignore. There is a growing sense that the yard is no longer just a static place, but a small network of interactions where presence itself changes the behavior of everything around it. Even the light feels different now, not brighter or dimmer, but more focused, as if attention itself is shaping what is being perceived. And in moments like this, your awareness begins to stretch beyond the immediate scene, because once you start recognizing patterns in living things, it becomes harder not to wonder what those patterns are responding to, and whether what you are seeing is only about birds at all, or something larger that you have simply not named yet. And that question begins to follow you quietly into whatever happens next. By the time the morning has fully unfolded, something inside the experience of watching begins to shift in a way that is harder to describe with simple observation, because it no longer feels like you are only witnessing behavior, but instead witnessing relationships forming again. Yet now the movement feels less like arrival and more like continuation, as if it never truly left but only moved outside the range of your immediate attention. There is a subtle but persistent sense that the yard is responding in layers, not just to sound or motion, but to consistency, to familiarity, to the repeated existence of a single observer and a single observed rhythm unfolding over time. Many people who spend long hours watching backyard birds describe moments like this not as dramatic events, but as gradual emotional shifts, where the boundary between instinct and interpretation becomes less distinct. Some even believe that birds do not simply react to environment, but also form an awareness of patterns that include the presence of humans who remain still long enough to be noticed in return. Whether this is biological adaptation or something more difficult to define, it becomes increasingly hard to dismiss the feeling that interaction is happening on a level deeper than simple feeding behavior. Something about the timing, the return, the hesitation before approach, begins to feel like it carries meaning that extends beyond survival alone, even if that meaning cannot be fully translated into language. And as this thought settles in, the quiet of the yard no longer feels empty or passive, but instead feels like it is holding a question that has not yet been answered, waiting in the space between each movement for something you have not yet realized you are part of. By the time the morning begins to settle into a softer kind of silence, everything feels slower, not because anything has changed in a visible way, but because your attention itself has shifted into a quieter state, as if it no longer needs to chase meaning and instead is simply allowing meaning to arrive on its own. The Northern Cardinal now moves with a familiarity that no longer feels surprising, landing on the same branch, pausing in the same space, turning its head with a calm rhythm that feels almost meditative when you stop trying to interpret it too quickly. The feeder creaks faintly as it sways, and that small sound feels distant, softened by the weight of everything you have noticed so far, as if the yard itself has absorbed your attention and is now reflecting it back in quieter form. There is a moment where nothing new happens at all, no change in movement, no shift in direction, just stillness layered on stillness, and in that absence of action, something unexpectedly emotional begins to surface, not as a thought but as a feeling that is harder to name. It is the recognition that what you are watching has been unfolding whether or not you were fully aware of it, and your presence has not disrupted it, but somehow become part of it. Many people describe moments like this as a kind of quiet clarity, where the need for explanation fades, and what remains is simply awareness, soft and continuous, like standing in early morning light without needing to define why it feels significant. The bird remains still for a few seconds longer than expected, then shifts slightly along the branch, and the movement feels less like action and more like continuation of something already understood, And in that gentle stillness, the yard feels less like a place you are observing and more like a space you have slowly been included in without ever being asked. By the time the morning begins to feel complete, nothing in the yard has truly changed. And yet everything inside the way you perceive it has quietly settled into something deeper, as if the experience itself has folded into memory while still happening in real time. The Northern Cardinal appears one final time on the familiar branch, but now even its presence feels less like an event and more like a continuation of something that no longer needs to announce itself. The feeder sways gently in the soft air, the light shifts across the ground in slow patterns, and the entire space feels less like a place you were watching and more like a place that has slowly been watching with you. There is no sudden conclusion, no clear moment where understanding fully arrives, only a quiet acceptance that what you noticed was never separate from you in the first place, and perhaps it never was meant to be fully explained. And if you have stayed through this entire journey, thank you for being here until the very end, because stories like this are not just about what we see outside our windows, but about what begins to change inside us when we slow down long enough to notice it. If you find meaning in these quiet explorations of nature and something deeper beneath it, you can subscribe before you leave, not as a habit, but as a way of staying connected to these moments that often go unseen in everyday life, because there are still many places where attention reveals things we were never taught to notice. And as this morning fades into its own silence, the feeling it leaves behind does not fully leave with it, as if something small and unseen has agreed to remain just beyond the edge of awareness. And maybe it was only a bird in a quiet yard on an ordinary morning, but it never truly felt like only that. And somewhere out there even now, that same stillness may be forming again just beyond your window.